All right, are we expected to tithe the same way the widow did in Luke 21? Are we expected to tithe in the same way that the widow, let's go to Luke chapter 21, the way she did? That's a great question. And we're going to learn a little bit of Bible interpretation today on this one. Here we go. Luke chapter 21. You guys know the story. You've heard it preached 1,000 times by different pastors. Here we go. And he, Jesus, looked up and saw the rich putting their gifts into the treasury. Now, Jesus was in the temple. He was teaching. He was in the court of women. And that was the place where people came and made their offerings. They had up on the wall there 13 funnel-shaped, almost trumpet-shaped funnels, I should say. 13 of them, big ones, that had listed what you were donating for, okay? You had 13. So Jesus is there teaching, and we're told he looked up and saw the rich putting their gifts into the treasury. And then Jesus saw somebody else. Who did he say? A widow? What kind of widow? Poor. In the Greek, it means destitute to the point of having zero, nothing. He saw a poor widow putting in 2 small copper coins. And Jesus said, truly I say to you, this poor widow put in more than all of them. For these rich people, put in from their surplus, but she, out of her what? Poverty, put in some that she had, all that she had to live on. Stop. How many times have you heard, I'm sure you did, where you're from, pastors have preached on this, and have said, see, you need to start giving like this woman. And I know a lot of you are struggling financially, and I know a lot of you don't have much, but that's not an excuse. Look what Jesus said about this woman, how Jesus was so proud of her and how Jesus bragged about her because of the good things she did. Is that what Jesus said? Jesus didn't comment and say, hey guys, you need to follow her example. Look what she did. She did a good thing. No. Again, look at the words, key words. Verse 2. Poor widow. Verse 3, poor widow. Verse 4, poverty. Verse 4, all that she had. What was Jesus saying here? In order to understand the text, we've got to broaden it a little bit so we understand the overall context. Right before chapter 21, verse 1, remember, back when the Bible obviously was inspired by God, there were no chapter breaks, no verses, right? That was added on later. So literally, you've got to now connect the end of chapter 20, verses 45 through 47, you've got to connect it to the woman putting in all her money. What do I mean? Verse 45, again, remember of chapter 20, Jesus is in that area teaching. And while all the people were listening to him, he said to the disciples, beware of whom? The scribes, the teachers of the law, the people, the teachers who were supposed to be leading the people towards God in the ways of God. Jesus said about the teachers, again, he's in the temple saying this, Beware of these people. Why, Jesus? Well, number one, look at their pride. They like to walk around in long robes, and they love respectful greetings in the marketplace, and they love the chief seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at the banquets. You see them? They were in it for the show. They wanted the praises of man, but there was something even worse. Look at their teaching. Verse 47. Who did they devour? Widows' houses. And then, once Jesus said that, chapter 21, he looked up, he saw the rich putting their gifts into the treasury, and he saw a what? Poor widow who gave all that she had. Watch me. Why? Because of the teaching of the false teaching religious leaders. And how did they devour the people? How did they devour the widows? What were they teaching regarding salvation? How did they say a person was saved? Through grace alone? No. Through faith alone? No. In the Messiah alone? No. What did they teach? You had to do this, 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 you had to keep doing this, you had to keep doing this, you had to keep doing this. So Jesus first warns his disciples about the false teachers, the false religious system that was set up there. Remember, Jesus had to cleanse the temple how many times? First time when he started his earthly ministry. Second time, right before he went to the cross, at the end of his earthly ministry. Why? Because it was a den of thieves. And they were teaching a false way of salvation. They were teaching it was through your own works, your own efforts, and through the false religious system, through the priests, through the teachers, through the temple. They were teaching works salvation. And that's how they were devouring people of their money. They were devouring even widows. So again, that's why Jesus said at the end of verse 20 about these false teachers, they will receive greater what? Condemnation. Because they were teaching false doctrine. That's why James says in chapter 3, verse 1, not many of you, my brothers, should be teachers. Why? Because we will be held to a what? Stricter judgment. So, we see in the context, Jesus is warning his disciples about the false teachers who, oh, by the way, besides being in it for the show, the flowing robes and this and the greetings, they were devouring widows' houses. How? Widows? No one could take care of them. I mean, a widow couldn't take care of herself, I should say. She's going to go get a job. If she didn't have any family, she was done. The temple, God's people were actually responsible to take care of a widow, who was a widow indeed. Instead, these false teachers, instead of taking care of the widows, they were devouring them. And they were saying, you better get everything you have and pay, hoping you're going to get to heaven. And this poor woman, chapter 21, after the rich, they put their gifts in the treasury. Jesus says, let me give you an example of how the religious leader devouring widows. He goes, you see this poor woman right here? Putting in 2 small copper coins. That's all the woman had. Why'd she do that? Because she was being mistaught about the way to salvation. She did this out of fear. Jesus said, truly, I tell you, this would have put in more than all of them. For the rich people just put out of their surplus in there. But out of her poverty, she put in all that she had to live on. Was Jesus commending her for doing that? Was Jesus saying, this is the way you want to give? Nowhere in the Bible does it say that. This poor woman gave all that she had and went home and waited to die. And that's why Jesus says in verse 5, while some of his disciples were talking about the temple, they said, wow, look how adorned it is with beautiful stones and votive gifts. Hello, guys. Where do you think the temple got to look so nice from? Where do you think these religious leaders got their flowing robes and all the nice seats and the banquets? Where do you think that all came from? Devouring the people, teaching a false way of salvation. And what did Jesus say about the temple? Verse 6. As for these things which you're looking at, the days will come. This false system is coming down. The days will come in which there will not be one stone left upon another. It will all be torn down. And we know that happened, right, in 70 AD when the Romans came in. So Jesus condemned the false priesthood who was teaching a false religious system. And Jesus says, they're going to be held to a stricter judgment. And this house that's supposed to be the house of God, it's been turned into a den of thieves. It's coming down. And it did. And Jesus used this woman as an example of how bad the teaching was. And yet, how many times have you heard that text preached? And you hear people saying, look, you have to give. Look, you know, this woman gave everything. And look how Jesus commended her. And therefore, Christian, you better start giving more than you're giving. If you don't have enough faith. You see how they misuse that text? In fact, do you know that in the New Testament, tithing is not a command? Now, you're not going to hear a lot of pastors preach that. Why? Because they want people to tithe. Tithing is not a command. It was, look, in the Old Testament, you have to understand, the nation of Israel was a nation under God. It was what was called a theocracy, right? Okay, do we live in a theocracy now? No. Okay? And therefore, back in the Old Testament, the nation was required to provide for the nation. So the nation was function. And as a nation under God, what was its government? The priests and the Levites. So part of what the people gave was like a tax to pay for their government. Also, you had the temple upkeep, paying for the religious festivals, also paying to help the poor people. They couldn't go out and get jobs. They didn't have an internet where you could just find jobs. Listen to this. In the Old Testament, that giving was not a tithe. It was like taxation. And all that giving averaged out annually somewhere around 23 to 24%. You understand? And then, if God's people wanted to give over and above that, that would be their tithe. Like a gift offering. New Testament, do we give to the nation? Yeah, it's called paying the government. Romans 13. Right? As Christians, should we give over and above that? Watch me. If you want to, but only if you have come to that decision in your heart. What do I mean? Go to 2 Corinthians chapter 9. Here's the command when it comes to tithing in the New Testament. Verse 7. Each one, talking about Christians, must do just as he has purposed in his heart. Not grudgingly, not under compulsion or guilt. For God loves a what? Cheerful giver. So how about this? People are being misled and being commanded that they have to tithe. Very often they're being mistaught Luke chapter 21 about the poor widow, and they're being made to feel guilty about their giving, their lack of giving, or it's not enough. Well, guess what? Then these people give. Are they doing it with a cheerful heart? Is God happy? Does God really need our money? What does God deserve? Our worship. Giving is an act of worship, right? And you do it in spirit and in truth, right? Just like you worship, singing and praising God is an act of worship. Just like praying is an act of worship. Just like studying the scriptures is an act of worship. Just like celebrating the Lord's Supper is an act of worship. Just like giving is an act of worship. If you're not doing it in spirit and in truth, guess what? You're being a hypocrite. And as a pastor, I never want you to rob you of the joy of giving. That's why I won't force and put a box in front of you, or put something in front of you. Give. Because what are you going to do? Here it comes. All right, we got to give. Thanks. Are you worshiping God at that point? Are you even thinking about it? You're just like, you don't even think. You're just doing it. It's not an act of worship. So, if you want to give out of a grateful heart because of what the Lord has done and continues to do for you, then give. But don't announce it and show off. And don't do it out of obligation. It needs to be an act of worship. When my wife and I tithe, and we do, we together will pray before church, by ourselves, before we even finish the check, writing the check. It's an act of worship because God loves a joyful, cheerful giver. That widow in Luke 21, you think she was joyful and cheerful giving her last 2 coins to go home and die, hoping that she might get to heaven? You think she had joy? So, answer to our question, are we expected to tithe the same way the widow did in Luke 21? What's the answer? No. Very good.